are overly sexualized these days, which is another example of genius storytelling here. This first sequence was inspired by The Substance 2024, a refreshingly new and original body horror that I fully believe will become a classic as the years go on. But what you did not recognize, and what I didn't tell you, was that I was equally so, if not more inspired by legendary Canadian horror and mainly body horror legend David Cronenberg and the usage of the eye as an overarching concept in his film Videodrome from 1983. I believe this is the main reason why Canadian horror's influence on the more popularized genres that we know today's ego horror, body horror, and the slasher often gets put under the rug and passed off as non-existent, because the inspiration is often subtle, or you have to think about how it fits in for more than a few moments. Honor student Owen Davies from Lawrence University in Wisconsin had a paper last summer where he talks at length about the more in-depth concepts that David Cronenberg has put beneath the more simple horror visuals and stories. Quote, "Becoming is less concerned with moving from one mode of being to another, but is concerned instead with a shift from one set of powers and behaviors to another. This is what we see when Ren, the main character, develops his stomach slit, which is capable of reading information from tapes. Videotapes, to be specific. It does not take on the molar form of a tape player, but it is developing the function of a tape player. Max Wren eventually finds himself caught up with rebel groups who concern themselves with the new flesh, or the video word made flesh. This new flesh, which can be seen in Max's bodily mutations, is created through the application of new media technologies, specifically the Videodrome signal. Here we can see an example of Cronenberg's emphasis on the new. Bringing in Deleuze's concept of becoming helps illuminate a political dimension of this interest of Cronenberg's. Cronenberg's films frequently feature social factions or rebel groups who are heavily concerned with the new worlds and modes of existence which emerge in the films. Eco-horror. A genre of horror that usually gets swept under everything, from our popular genres and trends of genres like new parts to known franchises, especially within the slasher genre. With the genre tied with it, or at least placed in a close second, would be new and original additions to the paranormal and psychological horror genres. I think of them as one and the same because, for example, 2022's Smile has an unknown paranormal entity, or demon, but it is a psychologically themed movie heavy on those sorts of themes and messaging. Eco-horror tends to bring in more cult classics as their status quo than any other horror film genre overall. Though cult classics are hidden gems, the terms mean that there will be some entertaining ones in the bunch. The Thaw from 2009 takes on the still relevant messaging and concept of climate change through the plot device, or MacGuffin, if you will, of a prehistoric parasite being released from a melting polar ice cap. I think a good comparison to a more Americanized version of a movie like this would be 2017's Life. No, it's not about a prehistoric ice cap virus, but it is about a killer disease before our time that later is able to get to Earth through Jake Gyllenhaal's character, spoilers, in his escape pod. I think The Thaw is a more blatant eco-horror commentary on climate change overall, but I think it can be argued Life at least took a decent amount of inspiration from their concepts. I think as long as we have films in the ecological space, whether it be horror or eco-cinema, then I fully stand by the thought that we can be educated and appropriately scared enough of the nature around us, including our own human nature, to stop it. An essayist had this to say on the topic of the genre in our country a few years ago. Quote, "While there is variation across individual films, the eco-horror genre maintains as a fundamental trope the antagonistic relationship between nature and culture. This feature of Canadian eco-horror is ubiquitous throughout the genre, which on one hand imagines the disruption of culture by nature, and on the other hand, the restoration of culture through nature's overcoming." Quote, "The slasher. A glorious battle and fight for survival between the ultimate evil and the human will to survive and fight and love another day." As a partial author of the 2015 book, The Canadian Horror Film terror of the soul. Callum Vansdale says this about Canadian slashers. Whenever another Canadian serial killer or mass murderer hits the news, it is as though it were the first aberration ever to our otherwise mind-numbingly boring ethos, and everyone is breathless with surprise. Canada has monsters too. Indeed we do. A society that had no real monsters of its own, if such a place existed, would scarcely need to act them out in film, much less as compulsively and self-analytically as is done north of the 49th. Any portrayal of monster is at its foundation an attempt to understand the origins of our deep-rooted fears. Quote, with such a simply laid out concept, filmmakers in this genre often pull out all the stops on their creativity to make something truly special, innovative, and sometimes inspiring. I would say book adaptations and new editions or retellings of franchise stories and legacy characters are the two instances where innovation in the slasher genre is needed most. The Strangers retelling of the franchise from 2018 to 2024 to now, I think, takes some inspiration from the Canadian film Cabin in the Woods from 2011. I think both sets of films innovate the genre in their own ways, and I think it's another example of Canada, even just by location, doing it right. Even though it was Drew Goddard, an American director who directed Cabin in the Woods, I think the Canadian horror feel is there, and the fact that it was primarily filmed in British Columbia, Canada cements it as a Canadian slasher film in my book, even though it is just by location and feel and vibe. Much more Americanized slasher films that have taken inspiration are productions like Hush, 2016, The Strangers Pray at Night, 2018, Strangers Chapter 1, 2024, and currently in the series, The Strangers Chapter 2, 2025. They all end with terrifying fates and have interesting twists at play. My point is that all slashers have a different type of feel. I think what was so Canadian about Cabin in the Woods, is the wild, out-of-the-box, hectic, and crazy style and narrative that started with Cronenberg. In conclusion, horror is an incredible genre of film. Whether that's through story, filmmaking style, writing style, the depth and motivations of characters, especially through survival, and finally, the tragedy behind the monstrous antagonistic force or character. Even though the concepts and visuals presented in these types of films are not yet real or close to reality as far as we know, the messaging, warnings, and commentaries that are said through these films and their worlds are terrifyingly real. In fact, I think the key difference with Canadian horror, and specifically Canadian feature horror, is that since the innovative and experimental first instance of Canadian feature-length horror, especially through 3D incorporation, The Mask from 1961, as well as David Cronenberg single-handedly pioneering and popularizing the now very well-known genre of body horror, cemented the words Canadian horror. With The Mask, an author of Chapter 20 of a scholarly book titled The Oxford Handbook of Canadian Cinema, talks about how Julian Rothman's 1961 experiment paved the way for Canadian horror to be as influential as it is today. Quote, this low-budget 3D B-movie, directed by former National Film Board director Julian Rothman, and backed by movie theater owner Nat Taylor, who, side note, is very connected to York's history of film, was one of a small group of features made at the time in Toronto, in the hopes of kickstarting the commercial film industry. In all, there were no more than 15 horror films made in Canada before Shivers. In just the 10 years after Shivers, 3 times that number would appear. Quote, I think all these figures' influence, especially Cronenberg's, is felt through many popular horror films. These newer filmmakers might not even think of as films while making their films, but it might almost be instinct to incorporate Canadian, crazy, out-of-the-box, disturbing visuals, yet true-to-life commentary, from vivid memories or from some hidden ones. That's horror, eh? Bye-bye!